Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Tom's Hardware Show. I'm Sharon Harding, and it is October 8th, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, which means it's time to go live. Yes, everyone, thank you for joining us. We are live as always, and we are taking questions from the audience. So if you have anything you'd like to ask the Tom's Hardware editors here, put your questions into your chat on Facebook or YouTube, and we'll be answering questions by the end of the show. So we are all ready to dive into AMD's unveiling today of its next-gen Zen 3 architecture, which will be at the heart of its upcoming desktop CPUs, Ryzen 5000, also known by the codename Vermeer, for reasons I don't quite know. We have a couple great guys here ready to get into it all. First is Tom's Hardware Managing Editor, Matt Safford. What's going on, Matt?
Hello. It is a busy AMD-filled day, and the sun is out, and as I look at myself in this video, I realize I can never sit straight.
That's okay. Neither can I. Also joining us, because who else do you want to talk to on the day AMD announces new CPUs? Tom's Hardware Deputy Managing Editor, Paul Alcorn. What's going on?
Oh, nothing much. Just, a lot of excitement today with the AMD launch of its first Zen 3 processor. So, pretty impressive launch. They have basically they released 4 chips. It starts with the Ryzen 9 5950X, which is 16 cores and 32 threads for $799. It comes with a peak boost clock of 4.9 gigahertz, which they got just this close to the magical 5 gigahertz. But, that doesn't really matter because, clock speeds and performance are a function of IPC and clock speed. Now, AMD claims they have a 19% boost in IPC. So for that 4.9 gigahertz boost speed, they're going to get a lot more performance than they would have from the previous generation chips. They also announced the Ryzen 9 5900X for $550 with 12 cores and 24 threads. And then 2 of the smaller chips, probably the ones that will be most applicable to everybody who can afford them, which is the Ryzen 7 5800X for $450 with 8 cores and 16 threads, and the Ryzen 5 5600X for $300 with 6 cores and 12 threads. Now, the prices are a little bit higher than we're used to, quite a bit higher, as a matter of fact. It's $50 higher for each SKU in the stack compared to the Ryzen XT model. And those were pretty significantly overpriced as it was. So there's a lot of chatter about why AMD is jacking up prices. So it's definitely been an interesting day.
As I said earlier, they're jacking up prices because they're actually doing well, and they're doing exactly what Intel would do or any other company would do. They have an advantage now, and they can take advantage of that and make some more money. They definitely have they've come a long way in terms of performance and market share, but the coffers compared to their competitors are pretty paltry. So they need to do what they can to get some more R&D money.
Wasn't part of why they're doing so well, though, is because they kind of have the performance to value ratio down, and it's kind of where you go where you don't want to blow all your budget?
Yeah, exactly. And there is one thing with these chips. They do offer significantly higher performance than the previous gen models. So AMD says when you do the math of the price versus the performance, that these actually come out ahead. So, ahead of the previous gen models, even though they've been marked up by $50. But AMD is also kind of ignoring the fact that now they're not including a cooler with the 3 top models. Basically, any chip that's 95 watts and up will not come with a cooler anymore. And to find a cooler that's going to match AMD's box coolers, I mean, that was one of the biggest reasons why people loved AMD's previous gen chips, is because you got a cooler, and it wasn't just some Intel piece of aluminum. It was like a beer can. And they're really high quality coolers. You have to spend, I don't know, $35 to $50 in order to get a comparable cooler. So you have to add that on to the $50 that the prices have went up by. So they are significantly more expensive when you look at the whole picture.
Is there perhaps a technical reason they're not including the coolers? Like, are these going to require, heftier cooling that you couldn't provide in like a cheaper stock cooler?
That's absolutely right. So when you have when they spec the chip and they say how fast it can go, they do that based upon the stock cooler that comes with the chip. In this case, or in the normal cases of their chips, if they're just using a standard air cooler, they can't hit those high clocks that they've spec these chips at. So they recommend these chips to have a 280 millimeter water cooler, AIO, or equivalent air cooling, which means really expensive nodule, like $80, $100. I'm not sure where they're landing. So that allows them to give you a higher spec on the chip. But they're also doing that kind of to just boost their clock speed, sometimes only by 100 megahertz. Sometimes that jump from 4.7 to 4.8 can take a whole lot more cooling because power increases exponentially as you go up higher on your clock frequencies. So I guess there's kind of a technical explanation, but,
It's usually backed by money, though, right?
Yeah, there is also a because they can explanation.
Right? Yes, exactly. People are going to buy it. And we also do have to take into consideration the fact that AMD has never changed the recommended pricing on its Ryzen 3000 processors. And they have nothing to do with what you see in the real world. You can find some amazing deals.
That's what I was going to say. It might not happen by the holidays, but I would not be surprised if by January, most of these are well below the MSRP.
Yeah, even the Ryzen XT models, they pumped up the price on those, and at retail you see them a lot of times selling below MSRP. But interestingly, some of the better, cheaper chips from AMD have disappeared off the shelves. Some of the cheaper alternatives. So it kind of feels like they're pushing people towards the XT models. Whether that's true or just perception is another thing.
So we have a prediction perhaps from Jared, who says, I figure a 5700X could show up later at about $380 or so, but I suspect right now there's not enough supply to meet all markets. Is this something you guys could see coming out? 5700X for about $380?
They absolutely left a spot for it in the numbering scheme, and in terms of specs. Now, normally AMD releases fast chip, slower chip, fast chip, slower chip. They only really release the flagship chips of each class. So there's only one, there's only one Ryzen 7 and only one Ryzen 5, which isn't normal. Usually there are lesser models. Some of that may be because what they're trying to do simply is push people towards buying these more expensive models. Early adopters are going to pay the tax, and especially if they have no other choice. Even when you look at the release today, when they release benchmarks, they only release benchmarks on the 5950X and the 5900X. They didn't really release anything substantial on the cheaper chips at all. It's like they didn't want to talk about it, other than just list the bullet points. I mean, it's good business sense, but at the same time, those are the chips people really want to hear about.
Yeah. They also need to have something to show off and talk about at CES, which isn't that far away now, right? So
that's true.
I assume there'll be GPU news there as well, but I don't know. I mean, I'm gonna sit on my 2600X that is running this system right now, probably until January or February. But that 2600X probably will get replaced once the price drops a bit on these new chips.
Yeah, probably early next year, you'll see prices come down a lot. I mean, they have they claim the gaming performance leadership now, which is a big thing. That was the only missing piece of the puzzle. That was the one compromise. And, in our talks with AMD, they were pretty clear about, the goal all along has been uncompromised performance leadership in every single category. And really, they had it. Everything except gaming, multi-threaded. Their single-threaded was actually pretty good with like the 3950X. It was really impressive. In power consumption, price, everything was clicking together except gaming. So they think they have that solved. You're just going to pay for it.
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions who's watching right now, definitely put them in the chat. We'll try to get through them. I saw earlier an early question from Kevin Fernandez, which I think is the sort of question that often comes up whenever there's a new CPU announcement. The question was, will I be able to use a 5000 series Ryzen 5 on a B450 motherboard?
So this is where things get tricky. AMD originally announced many months ago that they would only support the Zen 3 chips on 500 series motherboards, so B550 and X570. And it raised quite a ruckus. They had a revolt in the RAMD forums and in the general backyard. I believe people took signs to
Oh, wow.
market.
Oh, yeah.
They didn't, but
Why not?
Yeah, exactly.
That's how you get things done these days.
There was a pretty big backlash. If there's one thing that you have to give credit to AMD for far, far, far more than Intel is they do listen to their customers. So they backtracked and they said, okay, we'll add support for 400 series motherboards like his. But the problem is there are a lot of caveats attached to that. You have to prove that you bought the chip. You can only flash your motherboard one time, and to the Zen 3 supporting BIOS, you can't go back. So if you're trying to sell your board on the used market, you might not be able to. And there are some other particulars that we outline in the article, but overall, probably the biggest con to doing it right now is that's not going to be supported until January. Now, for the 500 series motherboards, AMD told us that they've been sneakily shipping inside of all of the latest BIOSes since summer the code that enables Zen 3. So just about any 500 series motherboard that's out there, as long as you're on the latest BIOS or any BIOS released within the last few months, the Zen 3 chip will drop right in.
Cool. So if anyone else has questions, keep them coming. But I want to talk a bit about, what they talked about during the presentation today. One of the big things they were talking about is, like you mentioned, Paul, that 19% uplift in IPC. So what will that mean, in real life performance, and how relevant is that to gamers, which is what, they geared this whole presentation around basically?
Well, part of the thing that's going to have a real world impact is the means in which they gained the IPC. They widened out the core, they added enhanced, buffers and load store and execution ports and things of that nature. But more importantly, they unified their L3 cache. In the past, when you have an 8-chip, AMD's chips have multiple chiplets, each with 8 cores. In the past, inside of that 8-core chiplet, you had two little slices of 16 megabytes of L3 cache, but they couldn't communicate with each other. The cores inside of a chiplet could not all communicate with all of the cache inside of that package. So that creates a lot of latency, and games are very latency sensitive for memory. So now the biggest change that AMD has made, and it should be revolutionary in terms of performance, is it's just one big cache, and all 8 cores can access the same cache. There's no, or far, far less crosstalk, if any, especially if you're on a single chip, if that makes sense. And that's going to speed up gaming tremendously. It also means that they can get more work done per clock. So if you have a 4.9 gigahertz chip and you compare it to a previous gen model at the exact same clock speed, you're 19% faster in anything that you do. What that allows them to do is actually dial back clocks and power consumption. So it'll run cooler, faster, quieter. It's just everything that's good about 7 nanometer. And honestly, is why Intel is in a lot of trouble. Intel's really kind of on the ropes here, probably for the next year, I would say.
Yeah, that's a whole, related topic for sure. But that's one of the things I said this morning right after the announcement. If you look at AM4 since I guess it came out, socket actually came out before Ryzen. So they've had what, 4 or 5 architectures, no, 3 or 4 architectures and 4 or 5 chip generations on the same socket. And, with Intel, you're lucky to get one.
Yeah, exactly. And, 400. It was pretty cool, actually, in a way that Intel, that AMD didn't release new 600 series motherboards with this launch, which is surprising because motherboard OEMs typically almost demand that from the chip manufacturers when if they want their chips to be supported. This time it just works with everything that's already out there. I mean, you already have a big, robust selection of motherboards, both 400 and 400. You'll wait till January. But 400 and 500 series motherboards that are on the market, at decent pricing, especially 400 series. You pick them up really cheap. They're plentiful. There's all kinds of options in every form factor, size, shape, color, quite literally. And if you want to go all pink, you can. It's just a lot you can do with it, and it's all ready. So, pretty big win.
Wow, like plentiful products? You mean like, so if I tried to buy the product online and I added it to my cart, I could get it?
Yes, but we're only talking about the motherboards there. There's some concerns about AMD's chip supply. AMD, despite being the second largest x86 CPU supplier in the world, actually doesn't fab a single chip. They don't actually make chips, they design them. They contract with TSMC or Global Foundries in the past, and still for some little minor things, just different foundries to make the chips. And, those are the 7 nanometer process. You've got people like NVIDIA, you've got Apple, Qualcomm, all trying to buy this same production capacity. There's only a piece of the pie, and it's a bidding war to get that capacity. So whether or not AMD can keep the chips in stock is an open question. We've seen rolling shortages of the high-end 3950X, and then on the low end with the 3300X and the 3100, those have been ghosts. They've been out for 5 months, and you just constantly see in forums and Reddit enthusiasts in Twitter and everywhere else, enthusiasts saying, "Where are these chips?"
I had one on back order for a month, and I just gave up.
Yeah. And the thing is the 3300X and the 3100X are extremely fast for such cheap chips, right? The 3300X matches the 7700K from just a few years ago. What used to be flagship performance for $450, you can buy for dirt cheap, supposedly. So it's probably not in AMD's best interest to prioritize those chips because a lot of people would rather, spend, I think they're around 150, if I'm right, I have to look. But for a chip, instead of buying like a 3600 or more expensive models. We'll see what happens with the Zen 3.
I want to put a Ryzen 5000 chip with a 3080 or a 3090, and I feel like I might have to wait until sometime in 2022.
If everything aligns right, I'll be doing that very soon. But I may not be looking forward to it as much as you, because I have to retest everything. But there's no way we can go and test the Zen 3 chips without the latest GPU. So that is high on the to-do list.
So someone has asked the golden question, which is, will the Ryzen 9 5950X dethrone the i9 10900K as the best gaming CPU? But I wonder, is that what it's going to be competing against, or is it going to be against Rocket League?
No. Well, Rocket League is coming in Q1 of 2021, which means April 1st, or whatever month. It's right outside of Q1. It's going to be the last day and a little bit late. And it's probably going to be a short supply. I'm sorry. Intel just doesn't impress us anymore. So with the 10900K, it's actually not going to compete with the 5950X. They actually have pretty similar gaming performance. AMD's benchmark showed it flat. But the 10900K is a lot less expensive. The 5950X is at $799. The 10900K is at $472 if you buy the graphics model, and the 10850K is $453, and it provides the same gaming performance as the 10900K. So that's like a $250 delta. Okay. The new gaming chip will be the 5900X. It will beat, and it does by quite significant margins according to AMD's benchmarks. It beats the 10900K by a lot.
So there is a comment that says, sick shirt, Matt. So I just want to quickly take a look at his shirt. Oh, it's Futurama mixed with Men in Black. Nice.
Reservoir Dogs.
Oh, darn it. I almost watched Reservoir Dogs once. Almost. I have definitely seen Men in Black, though.
It's a classic.
I'll put it on the list. Okay, I'll keep the questions coming. I also have an okay shirt on too. If anyone wants to compliment that, feel free. So to get back to the Ryzen, so one of the interesting things I thought about today's presentation were those Cinebench numbers that they were sharing, pointing to, what do they say? So they had the first desktop CPU to ever break 600. So was it the 5900X they were showing with a score of 631 versus 544 on the i9 10900K? What does that tell us?
Well, what that tells you is that it does their processor does really good in a benchmark. AMD always does really good at. Cinebench tends to hold data real close inside the L3 cache and not a whole lot. It just generally the workload favors AMD chips. You know, AMD claims single-threaded performance with the 3900X, the previous gen, and it did win in single-threaded performance in Cinebench, but in nothing else. So when you looked at things, you know, in our review, we went over all of it. Anything with AVX or, you know, heavy distributions of AVX, different types of workloads. It just won in that one. So you have to temper your excitement, but at the same time, you also have to be pretty excited at 631.
Yes. As someone who's been testing CPUs long enough to remember when, like, you know, the mid 100s was kind of fast.
Yeah.
631 is damn impressive.
It is damn impressive. That's about the only way to say it. And if they're beating the 99 or the 10900K by 16%, and the 10900K is smoking fast in single threaded work. It's the top of all of our performance charts. So if they're beating them by a delta of that, even in other workloads, they're at the absolute worst, they'll only beat them by a few percentage points in different kinds of workloads. But that's, make no mistake,
I can't wait to see what the thermals comparing those two are going to be too, right? If it's like around the same performance.
God. So here's the thing, right? The AM4 socket, the one thing that AMD does not, it's great that AMD sticks with the AM4 socket. So we have all these motherboards that work with the chips, right? But there are a few caveats to that. And one of the drawbacks is they can't change the maximum power limit of that socket. It's 142 watts. That's the most that the chips can pull. You know, that goes beyond TDP. There's a bunch of reasons for that. But basically, at the end of the day, 142 watts is the limit. So AMD is getting more performance within that limit. AMD claims, and said this specifically to us, that they did not raise power consumption 1 watt. They literally can't. Yet they're delivering these massive performance gains. So when you compare it to Intel, who's already setting things on fire.
It's just so funny because...
And AMD is just faster, but within the same amount of power, but like significantly faster than the previous gen. That's cool stuff.
And it's such a swing from, 5-6 years ago when exactly the opposite was true. AMD's CPUs were, some of the high-end FX processors were, 250 watts TDP, I think, the 9590,
I mean, the basic rule of the semiconductor industry since Gordon Moore said it, the Intel guy, was that you're just not going to beat a smaller, denser process, provided that it's paired with the mature architecture. AMD Zen 3 is cleaned up. It's as mature as it gets. And 7 nanometers better than 14 by a lot. Intel has been lucky to clean by its fingernails for as long as it has, but it's caught up with them. I mean, it's not comparable. You just can't beat it.
Yeah, and Rocket Lake is supposed to be a new architecture, right? But the same process node, so...
Correct. So we're looking at either, there's some debate, and Intel hasn't said, it's going to either be Sunny Cove or what will be termed Willow Cove, which is a 14 nanometer variant of Sunny Cove. Now, we've seen plenty of benchmarks that have been submitted to online databases that do in fact prove that it is a different architecture because the cache sizes are different for L1, L2, L3. There's no way to fake that. And it's been in multiple test submissions. So it definitely has a new architecture. Now, when you look at Ice Lake came with the Sunny Code microarchitecture, and it delivered 18% higher IPC performance relative to Skylake. Now, that was back in the day, when you measure time in the semiconductor industry, a few years ago is a long time. But that's about what we're looking at over Skylake under best case scenario. So, Intel may be able to get within striking distance, but the problem is you're still on the 14 nanometer node. When Intel got those big gains at 10 nanometers, because 10 nanometers sucks less power, so they can clock it, right? They might not be able to clock it as high. So, who knows? But I don't foresee all that power.
That also could mean sometime next year that they could still be on 14 nanometer on the desktop when AMD hits 5.
Correct. That is absolutely possible. The one thing about AMD is you've got to give it to them. They have just executed. They don't miss a timeline for anything. Sometimes, customers complain with rough BIOSes and things like that, but they're a machine. Right?
Yeah, but Intel has all the pluses. Plus.
And all the money.
Oh, that too.
and all the money, correct. The only thing, in my opinion, that's going to hold AMD back is how many chips it can punch out. That's it. At least when it comes to desktop chips. And even a laptop, they're making really good progress. Tiger Lake is pretty impressive, but with Zen 3 already coming to desktop chips, I'm pretty sure you're going to see some new laptop chips by the end of the year.
So looking at some of the questions we have in, Ski Bum asks a question, how do we think the 5600X will benchmark against the 3700X, two less cores, which has two less cores, the 3700X, I'm guessing? Do we know?
3600X has, 5600X is 612 and 3600X is 612, if I'm not mistaken. Is that incorrect?
3700.
Oh, excuse me,
Yeah.
3700X. Okay, so how will it benchmark? That will depend upon a lot of factors. So you have a lot more performance per core, excuse me. In single-threaded work, it's going to beat it. There's no doubt about that. The 5600X will beat the 3700X in single-threaded workloads. When you get into multi-threaded workloads, that's kind of it'll be a toss-up based upon the chip power limits and how it cools, because it's hard to make real definitive statements based upon AMD's maximum boost clocks because they only apply to one physical core, and then the boost clocks vary from chip to chip in the multi-core ranges. So multi-core workloads, depending on how refined the 7 nanometer process they use with the 5600X is, they could win because the 3700X isn't using the newer version of 7 nanometer that they're using with the 5600X. So you look, the 3700X is kind of almost 2 steps back.
Yeah, I don't know though. Depending on what he's doing with that, I wouldn't. If I had a 3700X, I would sit this out. Especially for gaming and just general purpose use. Yeah,
beating it is a matter of degrees. Is it going to just edge past it by a few frames per second in some games? Is that worth it?
Right.
That's hard to say.
Dylan McKinney is also looking for some advice. What will pair well with the RX 5700 XT graphics card out of the new CPUs?
Any of them?
I don't know. Oh, you're saying any of them. I thought you meant which of the CPUs are they asking?
Of the three that they announced today?
I guess another question is how do you decide? So that's a pretty... how do you pair them up? So do you need the high-end CPU for the high-end graphics card? Where's the bottleneck there?
Well, the goalposts have definitely shifted. It's hard to say. You know, AMD is saying 30% improvement in some cases with gaming, but that's only on the chips that it highlights. And the chips that it's highlighting are dual chiplet chips. The single chiplet chips should be exceedingly fast at games. I mean, you could probably get a 5600X and push that along, I would imagine. But, you know, until there are actually chips in the wild, I'm not going to tell you how to spend your money. Right? I mean, we need to see some CPU performance.
Right. Yes. So we have a question from Sebastian, basically on stock, which we kind of touched on a little bit. I'll just read the question real quick. I finally want to replace my old build with a 6700K, and I'm eyeing AMD. Taking current circumstances like scalping and availability into account, do you think it's well worth risking to wait for a 5800X? So I guess the question is, does he buy the current gen or wait for the next gen? And then the next gen might be sold out and he already wants to replace his build.
I mean, the old ones are still going to be there for the coming months, if not much longer, given how we've still seen stock of, AMD CPUs that are a couple generations old. So, I mean, why not? If what you have is okay for the next few months, yeah, I would wait until I see how these do, and then make your decision.
Yeah, I have a feeling we're going to see some really high pricing, and there's a lot of pent-up demand. And some of the previous AMD chips haven't been a real straight, clear cut forward from the previous gen. So when you looked at XT, like nobody I know, and if they would have done it, I would have, said you're not very smart. Upgraded from a 3000 series chip to an XT, right? Because there's nothing there. I mean, it's not, like I said, the matter of degrees, very, very limited return on that. But this is a big jump forward. So I think you'll see not only people coming off of first and second gen Ryzen, but it drops into the same socket, the same motherboard. People are going to come off of third gen. I would not be surprised at all to see shortages. In fact, I expect them. So you probably might want to just count on waiting unless you want to pay scalper prices. We'll see.
Well, no one wants to pay scalper prices. Well, thanks for the question, Sebastian. I am curious. I wonder why they decided to move from Intel to AMD. If you're still watching, Sebastian, let me know. Yeah, Paul?
In terms of a performance improvement, moving from a 7th gen, right, or was it a 6th gen?
6th gen.
6th gen Intel to the 5800X is going to be a massive improvement. Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. Is right now the time to do it would be more of the question. I don't think that if you could get the 5800X at or near MSRP, that you would, I don't think that you'd be disappointed. An 8-core 16-thread processor is going to do you very well, just as long as that 6700K.
So keep the questions coming, but in the meantime, I have a question, or maybe just like a rant or complaint. We're talking Ryzen 5000. The last gen of desktop CPUs was Ryzen 3000, and I was just always raised to believe that 4 comes after 3. So anyone know what's going on? Is this just to avoid confusion with the APUs, or do we have an explanation?
AMD has no explanation that's coherent that explains why they decided to start naming their laptop chips Ryzen, a generation ahead. So they have the desktop chips, and they say, oh, well, the laptop chip is Ryzen 3000, but it's the same gen. I think it was kind of a thing where they were, trying to work their way into the laptop market. So, sometimes numbers impress people.
Yes, and I would say that's more than likely that was the answer, because I know for a fact from talking to these companies over the years that laptop and desktop vendors like new numbers. That's why in the past we've seen basically both from NVIDIA and AMD on the GPU side, we've seen new cards with higher numbers that are the same silicon and sometimes almost, if not exactly, the same specs and clock speeds, right? But if you have a laptop or a desktop that came out last year and it starts with a 5 and the whoever it is, Lenovo, MSI, anybody is coming out with a new laptop, they don't want another 5. They want a 6 or a 7. So
and they dictate terms because they're OEMs and they buy in volumes that are massive. So yeah, that's a really good point. In either case, they decided to fix it, confusing everybody. But at least this is just going to be a momentary shock to your system. From now on, they'll all be, 5, 6, 7.
Yeah, like is the gen after this going to be Ryzen 7000?
Well, no, they're on 5. They're on 5 now. So next
No,
one.
yeah. Are they going to jump to 7, or are they going to?
Oh no. They should go. I don't know. They haven't answered that. Lucky number 7. Who knows? I mean, maybe they'll get up to 10 like Intel and not do something smart like restart. Because now we have things like the 10900K, and soon we'll have the 11900K.
Listen, we still have NVIDIA with, their lower end cards having different number schemes than their higher end cards. So there's always number confusion in this business.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for my iPhone 9 to come out. I think it's going to be good. So Sebastian actually got back to us, so I want to read their comment and hear what Matt and Paul you think. So Sebastian is switching from Intel to AMD because AMD seems to be a little more future-proof compared to the technical backbone at the moment, and they also pointed to the multi-core performance being great for 3D. Do you all agree with that?
If you're doing any type of parallelized workload like 3D, I'm assuming you're referring to rendering or some type of processing workload, then yeah, absolutely.
Blender, sculpting.
Yeah, don't look back.
Although I would say if he's looking to future proofing, and that's something that's really important, I don't know if I would want to buy into an AM4 system. Like if you want to keep it for several years, if you can wait, you might want to wait for another generation, and like there's a good chance we might have whatever's after AM4, and if they repeat anything like they did with this, if you jump on that platform, you might have something you could use for 4 generations of upgrades. Not that there's any indication that they'll repeat this, but they could. They've done it before.
Well, they built their brand on it. I mean, one thing is for certain: if you buy Intel, that will be a dead industry. You can go back with Rocket Lake chips will work in current gen motherboards, but they'll release 600 series motherboards at the same time. As a matter of fact, that's why the launch is purportedly delayed. There's problems with that still. And nothing wrong with the chips. Now they say it's the chipset. Again, same chipset, but just a different component. Anyway, 600 series will be the end of the line for Rocket Lake. And then AM4, I would agree. I'd be inclined to say this is probably the last chip.
AM4 comes to an end with Zen 3 as a prediction. Jared actually had a question, which is, when will we see Zen 3 APUs? Do we know anything about that?
I've been convinced for months that they were going to release an APUs. I mean, first, because it makes so much sense, because they can use Zen 3 for both desktop and laptops. They did say
yes again.
Yeah, they did say that they will release. When they launched the last APUs, they did that only for OEM, and nobody can buy them. But they did promise we are going to release new APUs for 500 series motherboards this year. Now, they didn't say Zen 3, but come on, it's got to be Zen 3. Don't forsake me again. Come on.
So in terms of because Intel made their Rocket Lake announcement, or revealed some information, I guess, about Rocket Lake. What was that? Was that yesterday?
Yes.
Kind of like swooping in, stealing a bit of the spotlight.
My joke of they were like, don't pay attention to what's happening tomorrow. Look at what we have next year.
That's pretty much the long and the short of it. I mean, is somebody going to wait out the holiday season, for Intel on some unproven chip that may or may not come within the next 5 years? It's I just don't see that being very enticing, especially when all you do. It's the first time they even mentioned the chips. Here's my deal. How proud are they of these chips? They haven't mentioned them. They even mentioned the next gen Alder Lake what was it, last month, maybe 2 months ago. But that was the first official acknowledgement that Rocket Lake is coming, and that's next. So it's just weird, and they didn't give any performance data. There's nothing there other than it supports PCIe 4.0. Well, welcome to like 2018, right? I mean, here's an 11 gen chip that supports PCIe 4.0. That's literally what they said.
Well, they also pointed, did they point to some upgraded or at least good integrated graphics? So I think they're saying you could do 1080p gaming with its integrated graphics.
Yeah, XELP is supposedly coming with it. Now, again, Intel hasn't confirmed anything. But, XELP will bring big time, hopefully, improvements over HD 630 because they've rebranded HD 630 forever. Well, now it's UHD 630. That's better than HD 620 or whatever it was.
So
it's
the question is,
thing.
Will they launch Rocket
integrated
League?
graphics? Sure, yeah. It might be better, but is that something that's going to attract the people who are looking at AMD chips that don't have integrated graphics?
Right.
No, and will they
no.
Will they launch it with integrated graphics, make a big deal out of it, then sell those out, and then weeks later launch a KF version without the integrated graphics?
Yes.
Yeah. Maybe even right at launch. It's just so hard to tell. Intel at one time was predictable.
So what are your thoughts? Because again, I'm sorry, I can't remember the title of what the announcement was, but it was something like something about gaming, and it's clear they're trying to, like Paul said, get a better hold of the gaming market. And they showed off some benchmarks, but basically I'm just curious what you guys think how this is going to do when it comes to the gaming market, and what will it take for AMD to really compete, if not top Intel.
I've always been of the opinion, and I've written it down in reviews a lot of times, AMD doesn't have to beat Intel in gaming. They just have to be the same, or so close that it doesn't matter. And really, they were knocking right on the door of that with Ryzen 3000. In most cases, we're still, look at our best CPU list for gaming. I mean, the price to performance wins there. And they're often slower. There's a chart right up there, full disclosure, a performance chart that shows you that oftentimes they're actually a little bit slower. But does that matter? If it's just a few frames per second, but you're saving all of this money everywhere else.
And just a few frames a second at 1080p, right?
Correct.
Like if you're spending $300, $400, $500 on a CPU and probably pairing it with a $500 to $700 graphics card, you're probably not gaming at 1080p. So
yeah,
not even.
It's true. It does even out, but of course, people always feel like chips that are faster in gaming will be more future-proof with future gens of GPUs, because you will replace, at least if you're a dedicated gamer, more often than not, you'll replace that GPU at least once, maybe even twice before you replace your chip. Heck, talk to the guys who are still running like 2700Ks. They probably have 8 or 9 GPUs on the same chip. So being faster is, people feel that's indicative of long-term performance. In the future, that's debatable. So that's just the one nagging thorn in AMD's side. They win everywhere else. If they can just match them, but it looks like they're going to beat them, then that's it. It's what they've been saying they're after: uncompromised performance in all workloads, dominance.
What's your take, Matt? Do you think Zen 3 is the next king or queen of gaming CPUs?
I mean, probably, unless, or it might be like very short-lived, if Intel can push out a Rocket Lake chip, that, is doing something crazy like 200 watts and can hit like 5.3 gigahertz or something, then they might have
5.4
something. Yeah. So I mean, if they can do that on, a new architecture, like they'll probably take it back. But again, it's going to be a chip that almost certainly uses much more power, and knowing Intel will cost more. So if they can, edge a little bit ahead again and retake that crown, they will. But as Paul said, like, how much does that matter if AMD is 95% of the way there at, you know, half the power and half or 2/3 the price, right?
And, you know, that's just my opinion. Is AMD essentially just future-proofed itself against Rocket Lake. And Alder Lake is coming with a hybrid architecture that is, you know, big cores and small cores, that is probably the most risky thing Intel has ever done in the desktop PC market. I'm sure that the chip historians will correct me. But in recent history, that's a dang big risk. That's a pretty big risk. So are you going to bet on the new tech that we're not sure works correctly? I don't know.
So we have a couple questions in the comments I want to try to get through. The first one, there's some talk in the chat about if there's going to be a non-X series release. One person even pointed to a hypothetical 5600 for $200. The 5600X they announced is $300. So, I mean, I wish they would just, I hate like the idea of like, oh, maybe they'll release a cheaper or a little bit better chip if I wait like a couple months. Like, why can't they just give us the lineup?
Probably, if it exists, it's probably not going to be $100 less. It might be $50 less. You know, I mean, they have released non-X variants of chips in those slots, you know, for the last few years, so it wouldn't be surprising. But again, as Paul said, if they have any supply issues, it makes no sense for them to release that.
No, exactly. And we did during our you know, recent discussions with AMD, we did you know, that question did come up. If there were any other hidden OPNs, which are, you know, it's the part numbers, hidden SKUs, in other words, that we weren't aware of, maybe for the OEM market, kind of like we see with the Ryzen 930, 900, stuff like that. They said right now, currently, there are only 4 OPNs, but they reserve the right to make more. Of course, they can do whatever they want. As of now, no. But
right, yeah.
Who knows?
So do you think they know whether or not they're going to do it, or they wait and see how the chips they announce sell and then they make their decision?
I mean, it's the same silicon. All they're doing is twiddling knobs, right? So, they, you know, it's like they can do it if they want to, if it makes sense. You know, I don't think it requires much effort to dial some things down.
I think some of that might be predicated upon the quality of the silicon that they get once they hit volume. If they get a lot of chips that are binning at lower clock ranges, then it may become more, you know, expedient for them to do that. And you don't want to call it dumping bad chips, but selling lesser chips, they are be perfectly fine. But they just
remember
that higher.
I remember the X3 chips, you know, a decade ago, some of which you could unlock that 4th core. So they've definitely done that in the past.
And that's the problem that these companies get themselves into when they do stuff like that is, okay, so early when they start manufacturing chips, it's called the yield learning curve. At the beginning, they get a lot of defects and the silicon is lower quality. As they run more wafers, they start learning things. I mean, they're incredibly smart. And with each node, they get faster and faster at improving that yield. The yield starts going up as they ramp more chips. So if you jump the gun and you get some bad chips and a bunch of them early, and you start making SKUs around that, where you're tying yourself to that, when later, when the yields are better, you don't have to make those chips. Now you're forced to make them with good silicon that you could sell for more money. X3. See?
So there was one more question I wanted to get to, and it's actually an APU question, and there's an eyeball looking right at us, so we better answer this question. So we suggested that the Zen 3 APUs won't be out until next year. Should they go with the 4350G until then? I mean, we don't know what they're trying to do, I guess, but any thoughts there?
You'd have to be going low end gaming if you're looking at 4350G. That's a tough question. I believe that they were going to launch APUs first, and I was wrong. They did say that there is a new APU that will work with 500 series motherboards, which implies it's Zen 3, because remember, they were not supposed to work with 400 until they changed their mind. They have promised that will come this year. Robert Halleck, Senior Marketing Director of AMD, said that in an open briefing.
Well,
when they
yeah.
announced those chips. So,
But they said that a while ago, and as we've speculated, throughout this, I would not be surprised if they, it's like they planned to do that, and then they saw that they have some production constraints, and they shifted gears and went with the more expensive stuff first, because why not?
Or they could announce it like the 3300X, and you couldn't buy one to save your life. I mean, you literally, I don't know a single individual who's actually has one. So I know a whole lot of people who complain they can't get one. So that is a distinct possibility. Yeah, that is a distinct possibility.
I said one more question, but there is just one more, which I think we could just get through quickly. Will AMD ever catch up with Intel in clock speeds? You kind of talked about that in the beginning, right, Paul?
They don't necessarily have to catch up with them. They just
Yeah.
need to increase their IPC and make smart architectural decisions that reduce latency within the chip. You can do that through all manner of all types of optimizations, like optimizing critical speed paths with faster transistors that are leakier. They do all kinds of cool stuff. And those, the more work you get out of each clock, you don't necessarily have to beat them at higher clock speeds. And Intel's pushing so high on clock speeds, when they go to 10 nanometer, there's no way they're going to be able to match it. The fact of the matter is clock speeds are going to be flat, or they are going to decline as we continue to move to denser nodes. In the past, it was the opposite. They went up.
Plus, I mean, it seems like they could do it now if they really wanted to. They would just have to ditch the AM4 socket, right? Like, I mean, if they did something like Intel has done with the last couple of generations with the top-end CPUs, and just power everything that's cranked up.
Yeah, just throw all concerns about the voltage frequency curve and efficiency. Let's just fire up a few more coal plants.
Yeah.
What's interesting about that is
put a glacier on it to keep it cool. We got plenty of those. They're not going away.
Yeah. Intel used to be so conscious about power consumption. I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, they put out some study that they said that if they increased the power consumption on one of their chips by 10 watts, somebody was asking why they wouldn't push for more performance. They said it's not necessary. If we sell so many chips, they make 1 million per day, that if we increase power consumption by 10 watts, it equals X amounts of coal plants on a global scale. But apparently that doesn't matter anymore.
Well, like the thing with clock speeds is that's kind of like the thing everyone talks about. Like that's like the sexy thing to talk about, how high your clock speed is. So that's where, like a lot of the marketing is. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who just, compare clock speeds and core counts and, call it a day.
And I do too. I even see the 4.9 with AMD's chips, and even though I have this logical part of my brain that says, okay, that's perfectly good, that's actually really good considering IPC, I'm still like, man,
so close. Yeah,
100 megahertz to the magic 5.0, but there is no magic to 5.0.
Well, I guess I went through even more questions than I promised to go through. So I guess that's about all the time we have for this week's show. But we will be back next week on Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern time. So be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like us on Facebook so you don't miss any of the fun. And you can also download each episode of the Tom's Hardware Show as a podcast and take us with you. But before we go, I want to wrap up with a comment because I think it's a feel-good story to end the show with from Andre Mendez. I've upgraded from the last true king of overclocking, an Intel i5 2500K, to the AMD Ryzen 3600 last year. It was finally worth it 9 years later. I think we got you a little good.
I mentioned that the guys, he's probably, I wonder how many GPUs he has had over the course of that chip. So
yeah. That's, I mean, that's, to me, that's still, one of the great things about desktop CPUs, right? Is, you get a high-end CPU, it's probably going to last you, maybe 10 years before you really need to replace it. A lot of people will replace it much sooner than that, but you get a lot of use out of that.
That's for sure. You got 9 years. That's a long time.
I can't think of anything I've done for 9 years, so... Well, thank you for everyone who tuned in. Thank you so much, Paul and Matt, for coming to the show and sharing your insight. That is our show, and we will see you next week.
Take it easy, guys.
Bye.